He said I got to go see some
2011, the reason I left Phoenix was I came up to Seattle to start an agency with Mike and Jesse, which was called Baji. And essentially, my connection was Jake Johnson. Shout out Jake Johnson, who's still in Phoenix area.
Oh, shout out Jake. Come see us.
But essentially, he was originally from Seattle. We had worked together. And then he moved back to Seattle, started working with Mike and Jesse.
Oh, okay.
And then basically all of those guys were leaving Marcel at the same time and wanted to start an agency. They needed an art director. So they essentially brought me in. So I flew up here on a whim, had never been to the Pacific Northwest at all.
And you were in Phoenix at the time?
Yep. I was in Phoenix at the time. Had been there for like 5 years.
Yeah.
Something like that. Which
you're originally from Portland, though?
No, I'm originally from New Mexico.
Oh.
Originally from New Mexico, went to school down in...
I feel like New Mexico is like Nazareth. It's like, can anything good come from New Mexico?
Dude,
Jonny Ashcroft, that's good.
Lots of good things. Green chili. Green chili comes from New Mexico. There's a lot of good stuff. It's just on the DL.
Yeah.
But from northern New Mexico, went to school in southern New Mexico, and then moved out to Phoenix afterwards.
Got you.
Just because I had a couple buddies out there. I didn't have any like prospects on jobs graduating, but had some friends that had moved to Phoenix. Landon Armstrong, who was working at a illustration studio with Matt Fisher. Shout out Landon and Matt. And I did an internship with them.
Okay.
Provoke Creative is his like handle. He does a bunch of stuff in the Phoenix scene. Really
still
talented. Yep.
Bro, I need a list of all these guys you're talking about there.
Yeah. Matt was running his own podcast for a while too, called Embrace Your Struggle. It was called Embrace Your Struggle.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Which was about what?
It was all about like the creative struggle.
Which is?
I mean, that's sort of like, I think it's part of the process. It's like, it is the tension which you need, like the traction to create something.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's sort of like innate to the creative process. Stephen Pressfield wrote a great book called The War of Art.
Oh, I've read that.
Dude, so good. So
oh my gosh.
The struggle is
the
like...
resistance?
Yeah. Yeah, dude, that's what it is, right? It's the resistance. And I think that's almost like those birthing pains of creativity, like something wants to come out, but like you've got to like go through the struggle to get it there.
Yeah, I like for him to personify resistance as like the enemy, I feel like... Yeah. It was probably the best framing of everything I hear creators talking about, the stuff that keeps them from making.
Totally.
And again, like especially when you're trying to do creativity as a business, there's so many other factors in there. But I think something about like resistance that's always trying to keep you and how that relates to imposter syndrome.
Totally.
Probably most specifically.
Yeah.
Because it's always like at the moment when you want to make something, here, like
that's when it comes.
It tends to come right then, and you're like, where did this thing come from?
Yep. And that's like Stephen Pressfield's whole thing with resistance. Like he defines it as like this sort of like umbrella term called resistance, but it can like come in many forms, right? It's like procrastination. It's just like anything that wants to keep you from creating what needs to be created and what's in your mind. That's essentially resistance. And his whole thing is like, it's actually, if you learn to use that as like a navigating device, it's like when you encounter the most resistance, probably means you're on the right track. And actors talk about that. I've heard, I think maybe it was like Jim Carrey, Daniel Day-Lewis, one of those incredible actors. They talk about like they only take the roles that scare them. Mm-hmm. So like when they encounter fear, they're like, okay, this is the right direction to go.
Yeah.
And it's like the resistance.
Yeah. I've been toying around with the idea of writing an article of some sort that says like make the imposter your partner.
Dude,
because it's that idea of like, hey, this guy, this thing in my head, or this force that is always trying to keep me from doing something might actually be the thing that I need to, in some way or another, like wrestle into my process, or wrestle onto my journey, such that I treat it as a signal.
Yeah,
so the thing that's trying to scare me becomes a signal, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go down that path. And now the imposter, as much as it's trying to tell me not to do it, I've sort of re-taught myself, or almost like retranslated that message to be like, oh, this is actually what I should be doing.
Totally. And that's that same thing. I was just listening to I forget what podcast it was on, but it was Jocko Willink, and he was talking about, they basically posed to him like imposter syndrome, and is that an issue? And he said, no, it's actually a good thing, because that is there to force you to like overcome your own limits, because like it's like a signal, and you've got to like push back against that. Again, the resistance, it's just like this input. And once you use that as like a navigational tool instead of like something that's diverting you down other paths, like it becomes very simple. It's like, okay, what scares me? Okay, just run at that.
Go there.
And that's the right direction.
What's been, you've done a bunch of design stuff, which has been crazy. It's been showing up everywhere. I think for people who haven't done as much as you have, I think one of the questions is, how do I get the kind of jobs that you've gotten? Like how did you start getting the kind of jobs that you did?
Yeah.
Like, how did you start attracting those kind of clients? And then how did you create the processes to sort of like keep that going?
Yeah. I think what it is, and I was reflecting on this recently because I did a presentation for NMSU, which is where I graduated, a group of students there. And it was really cool, but I put together this talk where it was basically like, I called it a visual anthology, just sort of like talking sort of very on theme with creative works where we're at, like embrace the journey, but talking about sort of my journey from where I started at NMSU to sort of where I'm at. And I realized there was this theme, and it still holds true, where like you're not going to be able to get what you want to do like right away. But I've always sort of had this instinct where I was working on something, but then as like either my side hustle or just like a personal aspiration, I would start working on that stuff and sharing that stuff. And then that basically like paves the way for the next phase. So a good example of this was living in Phoenix. I was in-house at Fender, which was awesome, like doing really cool work, but I was like definitely bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah.
Like I was the newest designer. I was getting to do cool stuff. It was Fender, but it was more like, I wasn't getting to do like the big campaigns, and it was like, more internal stuff, but I was making it fun. But it was so slow, which was just like part of like the culture, our
agency life.
Yeah. Sort of set. But I started doing just sort of illustration explorations. Like I was more trained as a designer, but I've always been interested in illustration. So I started, this was early like internet days. So I just started like illustrating iPhone backgrounds and desktops.
Oh yeah.
And my free time and sharing those. But then that sort of led to me getting into editorial illustration work. I started getting a bunch of editorial illustration work.
Because they saw something that you had done that was just
exactly. So it's like the sort of personal project or the side hustle, whatever it is, that sort of like always paves the way for what's next. And I've always sort of done that. And early on, it was more like I was doing that in addition to what I'm, like the main gig. But as I've gotten further in my career, I've been able to steer into and just be selective about the projects I take, where it's like, I just do the work I want to do. And that often comes with like a financial hit, like it doesn't pay. I think Jessica Hish, who's sitting right across from us, which is crazy and rad, she was talking about the cool tax. There's a cool tax on like the type of work you want to do, where it's like might be really good exposure or just really fun, but it's not necessarily going to pay the same way. And I've always just been like, I've always been greedy for the projects I want to do more so than the money. So I've like intentionally taken like the less like financially sort of lucrative option for the work I wanted to do. Again, a good example of this was right after I moved to Portland. I was just sort of freelancing, and I was kind of content freelancing. I wasn't necessarily looking for a full-time gig, but things were slow. So I started doing work through Vitamin T, who's like, it's different in Portland than in Phoenix. Like those work placement sort of agencies are a big deal, because you've got like Nike, Adidas, and like they're the ones that can sort of get you those gigs. But anyway, I started doing work through Vitamin T, and I got 2 contracts. One for this agency, I won't name them, really great people, but it was like super corporate. I did a job for them, and then they ended up offering me a job. like an insane senior designer role with a really good salary, like benefits, all this stuff. But it was going to be like working on the Walmart, like back end, like employee portal. And I was like, man, as soon as they offered it to me, I started thinking like, if I do this for 2 years, I could sort of exit. And it was just a signal to me, like, if you're already thinking about exiting,
right,
that's probably not a good sign. But I had also done a job with this little boutique branding agency called Factory North. And it was so much fun. Like, I just really enjoyed the first experience of working on a project with them. And I just sort of done these 2 contracts, and before I knew it, I had 2 competing job offers. I had one from the sort of more corporate agency and then one from Factory North. And the more corporate agency, it was like $30,000 a year more, benefits, like there were all sorts of bonuses and stuff. And then Factory North was like significantly less. It was a small studio, just like run by my friends, right? And they couldn't offer all that. And it just came down to this like really binary decision. I was like, I gotta go Factory North. I want those pieces in my portfolio because that's ultimately what I wanted to do. And I made that decision, and I'm so thankful I did, because like my career would be on a very different trajectory if I didn't.
So if you're talking to like a younger designer or someone newer to like running their own business or own small agency, or even a student, talented clearly, but just doesn't, just new, right? Just early in the game. Like, what would you tell them? I mean, again, like you've been doing this for 20?
Yeah.
20
years
like
now.
So like you've got legit experience. Like what are you telling someone who's like, oh, well, I'm 5 years in.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're 15 years ahead in the journey.
Totally.
Like, what are some of those like key things you're like, I think this makes more sense if you, this is what to think about.
I mean, I think the main thing is you want to figure out like what you're personally passionate about and what you sort of like resonate with and gravitate towards, because ultimately, like, I always tell people, if I was doing anything else, like I would be really bad at it, but I love this so much that like it doesn't feel like work. So I can just like, when I stand back and look at it, like some of the hours I put in sometimes are kind of ridiculous. I'm like, wow, I'm very unbalanced in some ways, but I love it so much that it just like feels good.
Yeah.
So passion is free energy. So if you find what you're passionate about, like you're going to be massively more productive, massively more successful. So if you tap into that gives you basically a multiplier, right? That gives you like a multiplier for your career.
Yeah.
So early on, I would say just like, and I did this a bunch and I still do this, like experiment, explore. You've got to be a fan of these things and you've got to love these things. I tell people like, if you want to be a designer, like you've got to be obsessed with this stuff. You've got to like gravitate towards this stuff. You've got to like think about it when you're not working. And just sort of recognize that in yourself, recognize what you're attracted to and what you want to like tap into. And then like nobody's going to pay you to do it off the bat. So like you just have to do it for fun. Mm-hmm. And we have this incredible system now to where it's like you do that, you explore, you make stuff and put it on the internet. And then like that will just sort of like, that creates a feedback loop. So it'll come.
Yeah. And it starts generating momentum and then traffic and then jobs.
Yep. So I would just say, just like explore, be really into stuff and like just have fun with it. Don't be too precious about it. Don't overthink it, and make it from a place of passion first. And then the sort of like the path will open to you.
Yeah, that's dope. Okay. Last question. Passion is free energy. Dope quote. That's crazy. I don't know if you just came up with that on the spot, but it's like insane.
I've had that for a few years now. Yeah.
Yeah. That's crazy.
But it was a big realization. It's true.
Yeah. No, I agree with it. Like, I'm like, yo, cut that right there.
Yeah.
Do that. But I'm interested because you do a lot of brand work. And I think one of the key things about us and what we do at Showit is like the idea of letting people bring that brand to that website.
Yep.
Always been this sheet. But even just sticking to the brand piece, like how, especially for younger designers and people earlier in it, or just, again, like insight from just an experienced designer is always helpful. And you're going to be at Spark next year, fall. But how does someone translate the thing that they're passionate about and have all this energy for into the way that they actually sort of create brands for clients? Like, how do you create the balance where it's like, oh, I can actually inject a little bit of my design style in the way that I create your unique identity. And again, being here with like Jessica and Paula and you and Alan, you know, they've done that.
Yep.
But like, how would you sort of like guide someone along the path of saying, hey, here's how you develop your own style, and then here's how to apply that. Like, here's how to develop your own style through your passions and the things that you've put in the time to explore. So there's like a degree of self-discovery. It's like you got to spend time discovering yourself.
Yep.
But then once you've done that, now you've got tools to help others discover themselves. Like, how would you describe that process?
Totally. I think part of that is like, I mean, one, I'll say like, it definitely comes over time, just as like, you sort of understand yourself more and like understanding your own, again, those like super deep rooted, just like even beyond your personality, like the stuff you're just attracted to and you kind of like resonate with, which everybody has, right? But just sort of like realizing that, and a big unlock for me, which again, like didn't happen until like a little bit later on in my career, was you've got to like trust in yourself, sort of like once you refine that taste and you've just sort of lived in that world. And one way to do that, for instance, like for me is I build like mood boards as like a hobby, you know, like I know you do the same thing. Like we'll get to talking about somebody like, oh dude, I got a mood board for that.
Yep.
But like, that's what it is. Right. And that's really, you can do that for yourself and you can sort of define your own taste with just like a Pinterest board and just building that stuff and just having that stuff. And like, we're all sort of porous, right? So you just like, you enjoy that stuff. You just sort of like expose yourself to that stuff. And then on this sort of deeper subconscious level, that becomes part of like your creative DNA. So it's almost like you don't have to necessarily like right off the bat, you don't have to have the skills to recreate that, and it'll probably take a while. But if you just sort of like absorb that stuff, and we all have it, like, you know, the stuff you were into as a kid is probably going to resurface in some way. I was talking to my buddy Jesse Bryan last night because we were going on a talk, and like Jesse always rocks like really cool cardigans, and he's just got like the craziest cardigan collection. And it's one thing I've always noticed and appreciated about him. And it made much more sense to me last night when I was talking to him, and he's like, dude, I grew up on like Mr. Rogers. Like, it was so fundamental to my childhood and like who I was. And he was telling me that at one point, one of the sweaters came up for sale, and he said he bid in for like 10 grand. He's like, I wanted it so bad, but it went for like 50 grand. But I just realized, I was like, dude, you've like manifested your own version of that with the sweaters. Cause he's wearing like crazy all over print cardigans that's like red and black with bats. But I was like, you're doing your own version of the Mr. Rogers thing. And that stuff really does like get into you. And then you just sort of like, you recreate it in your own way. So that's what it is. It's almost early on. It's just like knowing what you like, sort of digging deeper into that, absorbing that. And then later on, that will just sort of like come out through the filter of you, like in a different unique way. And it's all about like recognizing, like when I start a brand project, like I very intentionally, like I am copying specific things. I'm looking at specific things, and I'm just saying like, I'm not going to overthink it. I'm not going to be precious. I'm going to start to recreate this. But then understanding now that I've done it enough years, through the process of me recreating that, it's not going to be a rip off of that. It's going to be my reinterpretation of that, because it gets like remixed in the algorithm of my brain, right? And it comes out as something new. And that's what creativity is. It's literally like, there's nothing new under the sun. You're not going to come up with any brand new ideas. Like, you're going to take multiple points of interest, multiple things you're into, combine those in a unique way, and then output it like in a different context. And like, once you understand that, like, it demystifies creativity. You're like, okay, cool. Rinse and repeat.
Right. And then how do you translate that to creating something that helps a brand communicate who they are?
Yeah. So that's a good point. That all comes with, this is a great tie-in to the brand world building workshop that I'm going to be doing at the Showit conference. And it's this sort of discovery phase of really digging deep into a brand up front is really important. And again, like if you just sort of build that and then absorb it, when you go to output the brand, it'll just naturally be sort of like that meaning, that DNA will be imbued within it. So I've started doing these sort of early discovery sessions, and I've sort of named it like brand world building. It's inspired by really getting into some like world building, like tabletop games that friends introduced me to, like D&D specifically, but like there's a whole sort of genre there. But I realized in the process of like playing those games, because ultimately that's like collaborative storytelling, which is like, that's what a brand is.
So cool.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if you just define sort of like a map, a world, a story that brand lives within early on, and like literally almost like building out sort of a character sheet for the brand. What are the motivations? What are the, what is the like default leaning of this brand? And just sort of define those foundational fundamental pieces up front. You give yourself this really wide foundation to build upon. And then that, because you have all that, like the roots defined, you can have a lot of fun with the actual build out. You can go places where you wouldn't get to, or you wouldn't allow yourself to go if you were taking a much more strict, traditional sort of like brand guide. These are the typefaces, these are the colors. Like it's got to go deeper than that. Like you've got to identify the DNA of the brand. And then that gives you so much space to just play around in that world and have fun.